He found the trail an hour after first light, and for a man who had spent his life learning to read the ground, it was almost too easy. A heel print pressed into soft earth at the lip of a stream. A fern bent the wrong way against its own grain. The faint, sweet smell of a ration tin that had been opened and closed again. He crouched, laid 2 fingers beside the print to gauge the boot, and felt the old certainty settle into his chest. 6 men, maybe 7. American boots among them, moving north and west into the deep green, a few hours ahead at most. He had red ground like this many times along the stretch of the Trong Son Road, the supply route the Americans called the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and many times the trail had ended at the kill. He stood, signaled his men forward, and began to follow. He had no way of knowing the trail had been left there for him to find. This is the part of the Vietnam War the histories tend to step around. Not the trackers of the North Vietnamese Army, though they were real and they were very good. The men they were sent to hunt, and the thing those men learned to do when the hunters drew close. The question this story turns on is a plain one. What happens when the best trail readers of the war follow a line of footprints into the jungle, and the footprints turn out to be bait? If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. To understand why a set of footprints could be worth a man's life, you first have to understand the road. By 1968, the Ho Chi Minh Trail was not a trail at all. It was a logistics network strung through the mountains of southern Laos and eastern Cambodia. Hundreds of miles of cut roads, footpaths, fords, fuel lines, rest stations, and hidden caches, all of it feeding soldiers and weapons south into the war. The most powerful air force ever assembled had spent years trying to break it and could not. Bombs cratered the road by night, and by morning the trucks were driving around the craters. The North Vietnamese answered the bombing with men. They poured tens of thousands of soldiers into keeping the road open and guarding it. By the count of former SOG officer John Plaster, by 1970, there were roughly 50,000 rear area troops protecting the Laotian highway system alone. After the Tet Offensive tore through South Vietnam at the start of 1968, the road mattered more than ever. The fighting in the cities had been beaten back, but the political ground had shifted under the war, and the pressure in Washington to choke off the flow of men and supplies grew sharper by the month. The Air Force ran a years-long bombing campaign against the Laotian Trail under the name Commando Hunt, dropping tonnage that beggars description, and still the trucks kept coming. The road was simply too long, too green, too easily repaired. Bombs could break a stretch of it for a day. They could not break the thing itself. What the generals needed was eyes on the ground, men who could walk in among the truck parks and the caches and tell them what was there and where to hit it. That was the gap a small and secret unit had been built to fill. The only Americans doing anything to that road from the ground belonged to a unit with a name built to be ignored. The Military Assistance Command, Vietnam Studies and Observations Group, MACV-SOG, or simply SOG. The name was chosen to sound like a room full of clerks reviewing paperwork, because the work it actually did was something the United States government would deny for decades. SOG was stood up in January of 1964, and within 2 years its small teams were crossing the border into Laos, Cambodia, and North Vietnam, places where American soldiers were officially not present. The men carried no identification. They filed cover stories. When they died over there, the records often said they had died somewhere else, in a place the maps would admit existed. That denial was not a formality. It shaped everything, from the unmarked weapons to the way a death was written up. A man could be killed on a ridge in Laos and listed as lost in South Vietnam. His family handed a story that did not match the ground he fell on. The men accepted it as the cost of the work. It meant that if they were captured, no government would come to their aid, and that if they died, the truth of where and how might never be told. They crossed the fence anyway, mission after mission, into country their own country swore they had never entered. Behind the men in the field stood a structure most of them never saw whole. SOG was run by a series of officers known as the Chief SOG, among them Clyde Russell, who stood the unit up, then Donald Blackburn, then John Singlaub, then Stephen Kavanaugh, then John Sadler at the end. The cross-border ground missions ran out of a branch with the dull cover name of the Ground Studies Group. And because those missions could blow up into an international incident with a single capture body, the authority to launch them ran up a long chain through the headquarters in Saigon and the Pacific Command and onto the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington. As the war went on, SOG organized its recon work into 3 regional commands: Command and Control North at Da Nang, Command and Control Central at Kontum, and Command and Control South at Ban Mi Thuot, each running its own teams into its own slice of the forbidden map. The men called the act of crossing the border going across the fence, and the fence ran the whole length of the war. The missions themselves carried code names that changed as the program grew. The first authorized cross-border ground operations into Laos in 1965 went under the name Shining Brass, later renamed Prairie Fire. The missions into Cambodia were Daniel Boone, later Salem House. The work along the demilitarized zone had its own name again. The names were swapped out when they leaked because the entire enterprise lived or died on never being officially admitted. A team that crossed into Laos was, on paper, somewhere it could not be, doing something that was not happening under a name that would be retired the moment the wrong person learned it. The first man across the fence set the pattern for everything that came after it, including the cost. He was a Special Forces captain named Larry Thorne, and his road to that jungle was unlike any other man's in the unit. He had been born Lauri Torni in Finland, had won his country's highest decoration fighting the Soviets in the Winter War, had fought the Red Army again in German uniform after Finland's war collapsed, and had eventually made his way to the United States and into the Army, rising into Special Forces under an Americanized name. By early 1965, he was helping write the procedures the new unit would use to work across the border. On the 18th of October that year, SOG ran its first cross-border mission, sending a small team of 2 Americans and 4 South Vietnamese against a suspected truck terminus on a Laotian route a few miles inside the line, with a cover story ready in case anyone was caught that they had been searching for a lost American cargo plane. Thorne had planned the mission, and he rode in a command helicopter to watch over the insertion. The team got in. He radioed that he was turning back. His helicopter went down in bad weather over the mountains, and he was gone. He was SOG's first loss across the fence, carried as missing for decades. His remains were not found and identified until the turn of the century, when he was finally buried at Arlington. The unit he helped build would spend the next 7 years proving, over and over, how thin the line was between coming back and not. SOG was wider still than its recon teams. From the very start, it ran covert maritime raids against the coast of North Vietnam under a program known as Operation 34A, sending fast boats crewed by South Vietnamese sailors to shell coastal targets and seize fishermen. In the same waters off the north where the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964 helped touch off the wider American war. SOG also inherited the grim business of dropping agents into North Vietnam by air and sea, small teams meant to build a resistance that did not exist. That program was close to a total failure. Most of the agents were captured soon after they landed, and many were turned and used to feed false reports back to the men who had sent them, a hard lesson that helped push the unit toward the cross-border recon work it became known for. And it waged a long campaign of psychological warfare aimed at the morale of the North. The recon teams became the part of the story that endured, because they were the part that worked best and cost the most, but they were one arm of a larger and stranger secret war that touched every corner of the map the United States said it was not fighting on. A recon team was tiny by the standards of the war around it. 2 or 3 American Green Berets and a handful of indigenous fighters, most often Montagnard tribesmen from the Central Highlands, or Chinese known. The senior American was called the 1-0, the team leader, responsible for where the team moved and when it stopped and when it ran. Below him were the 1-1 and the 1-2, the second man and the radio operator. A full recon company at a base like Kontum rarely held more than about 30 Americans. They went out lightly armed, with SAR-15 carbines, a suppressed submachine gun the CIA supplied because it left no traceable markings, a sawed-off grenade launcher, and claymore mines. They were never built to win a standing fight. They were built to see and to disappear. The tools were chosen for exactly that kind of fighting. The suppressed Swedish submachine gun, supplied by the CIA precisely because nothing on it could be traced back to the United States, was quiet enough to drop a sentry or a tracker without announcing the whole team's position. The standard weapon was the short CR-15, light and quick in thick brush. Some teams upgunned to captured enemy rifles, partly because the ammunition for them lay everywhere along the trail, and partly because a burst of that fire in a night firefight did not instantly mark the shooter as an American. The sawed-off grenade launcher threw a close-range blast of high explosive into a tree line, and nearly every counter-track came down in the end to the Claymore, the curved mine that sprayed a fan of steel balls across a kill zone and, fired at the right instant into a column of pursuing men, ended most arguments before they could begin. None of it was meant to win a battle. All of it was meant to break contact and get the team gone. Becoming one of those men was its own filter. The Americans were already special forces, already past one of the hardest selection courses the Army ran, before SOG ever looked at them. Then SOG looked harder. The unit watched how a candidate moved through jungle, how he thought when a situation came apart, whether he could keep functioning when nobody was coming to pull him out. A great many capable soldiers were turned away. The ones who stayed went to training sites like Camp Long Tan and learned a craft that had almost nothing in common with conventional soldiering, a craft of stillness and patience and reading ground. Before mission, a team went into a period of isolation, studying maps and photographs of a piece of the world it was about to vanish into. Everything was rehearsed. Everything that could be controlled was because so much out across the border could not be. Getting a team onto the ground in the first place was its own act of nerve, and it rarely belonged to the Americans. SOG depended on Air Force helicopter crews, and, as the war ground on, more and more on a small cadre of South Vietnamese pilots flying old H-34 helicopters the men called King Bees. Two of those pilots passed into legend inside the recon companies, known to the Americans only by the call signs Cowboy and Mustachio. By the accounts of the men they carried, they flew into landing zones in weather that grounded everyone else, hovered against the faces of steep hills where there was no room to set down, and at times beat their rotor blades into the vegetation to chew out a gap to drop through. The bond those flights created outlived the war. Decades later, the surviving Vietnamese pilots still came to the SOG reunions, and the men they had pulled out of Laos still stood when they walked in. While a team worked the ground, an aircraft circled above it carrying a forward air controller the teams called Covey, often an SOG veteran himself, riding in the back seat because he knew the men and the terrain by heart. When a team was hit, Covey brought the firepower, the propeller-driven A-1 Sky Raiders that could loiter low and slow and put ordnance in close, and gunships when they could reach. The first minutes after a helicopter touchdown were the most dangerous of any mission, because the enemy watched the likely landing zones from the high ground and the treetops, and began moving toward the sound the instant the rotor wash flattened the grass. A team's survival often turned on getting off that open ground and into the trees before the watchers could fix its position. Once a team was in the trees, the whole craft came down to how it moved. SOG men learned to walk in a way that left the jungle looking unentered. They stepped on roots and rocks, and the hard spines of fallen wood instead of the soft ground that takes a print. They moved slowly when every instinct screamed to hurry, and quickly through the open stretches where lingering meant dying. They went hours without speaking, passing orders by hand signal and by the small shared language a team builds over many missions together. When a man did disturb the ground, the indigenous fighters behind him often fixed it without being asked, riding a bent stem, smoothing a heel mark, brushing the sign back into the floor of the forest. On a good day, a team left only what a careful tracker would need an hour to find, and an hour was sometimes all the lead a team needed. The work was physical and mental at once, a steady act of erasing yourself from a place while you walk through the middle of it. The body paid for all of it. A recon man carried 60 pounds or more on his back through heat that sat above 100 degrees, in humidity that made every breath feel like effort, climbing and dropping through ground so steep, and so overgrown that a few hundred meters could eat an hour. He slept in snatches inside a tight perimeter, weapon in his hands, one ear always open. He ate little, and the water he drank had to be found and treated. He did all of it carrying the steady knowledge that an entire enemy system was hunting him, that one broken twig or one careless step could bring it down on him in minutes, and that if it did, the nearest help was an aircraft that might be an hour out. That pressure, held across days and then across one tour after another, is its own kind of wound, and many of the men carried it home long after the visible ones had healed. Recon was the name, but the work ran far wider than the word. SOG teams mined the enemy's roads and ambushed his truck convoys. They tapped his telephone lines, splicing into the wire the North Vietnamese had strung through the jungle and recording the traffic that ran along it. They walked in after the big B-52 strikes to count what the bombs had actually destroyed. They planted doctored ammunition, rounds machined to burst inside the weapon that fired them, in a caches the North Vietnamese would carry south and use. In one program, the unit recruited captured North Vietnamese soldiers, trained them, and sent them back across the border on missions dressed as the comrades they had left behind. And SOG did the thing the men dreaded most, which was to seize a living enemy soldier and carry him out for interrogation. A prisoner snatch meant starting a fight you needed to win in seconds, then running with a bound and terrified captive while his entire army came looking for him. One team, flying back to base with a prisoner aboard a King Bee, realized in the air that the soldier they had taken was a woman. In the shock of the moment, their grip on her loosened, and she threw herself from the open door of the helicopter to her death. The record keeps these things plainly, because to soften them would be its own kind of lie. That word disappears where the legend grew. Over the years, the men who came back from the trail, and the men on the other side who chased them, left behind a kind of folklore. SOG teams were said to vanish from the jungle as if the ground had opened for them. Some North Vietnamese soldiers who pursued them came to speak of the Americans as something other than men, as if no ordinary soldier could move the way they moved and leave so little behind. It made for a haunting story, and it has been retold many times since. The record asks us to set the ghost stories down. The men of SOG were not phantoms. The vanishing was a craft. It was selection and training and rehearsal. And most of all, it was the indigenous fighters, men who had read this terrain since childhood and could move through it without leaving a story behind them. When a SOG team disappeared from trail, it was not magic. It was work done very well by men who had practiced it until it cost them nothing. Those indigenous fighters carried more of the war than any account written in English fully captures. The Americans called them the little people, an affection rather than a description, and they were Montagnard from the highlands, Chinese Nung, Cambodians, and ethnic Vietnamese. They were not hired guides brought along for convenience. They were the team. What they could do with the ground was close to uncanny to the men who watched it. A Montagnard or a Nung could read a patch of jungle the way another man reads a face, taking in at a glance what had passed through it and when. He could lay a false trail, an experienced enemy tracker would follow off in the wrong direction and slip through brush thick enough to hide a standing man without leaving the brush looking touched. He had been doing it since before he could read, and no amount of American training fully closed the gap between what he knew in his hands and what the Green Berets beside him had learned in a school. On the recovery missions the men called bright lights, sent in to find a downed pilot or a lost teammate or to bring back a body, the indigenous soldiers went into the same fire as everyone else, carrying weapons and ammunition and bandages and sometimes a body bag and almost no food. On one of those missions, a Vietnamese soldier named Ha came out with 94 separate wounds and lived. The 1-0s said it over and over in the years afterward, that they were alive because of these men, and they meant it as plain fact, not tribute. The enemy who hunted them was no phantom either, and was just as skilled. As SOG's effectiveness grew, the North Vietnamese built an entire apparatus to find these teams and destroy them. Plaster has described the layers of it. Night security along the roads, sweep platoons, armored cars escorting the convoys, watchers posted on the high hills and on platforms in the trees to spot the helicopters coming in. Anti-aircraft guns up to 37 millimeters. Light tanks. Radio direction, finding gear to triangulate a team the moment it transmitted. Artillery zeroed on suspected hiding places. And at the center of all of it, dedicated counter-recon companies and platoons with human trackers and dog handlers, whose only purpose was to cut a SOG trail and run it down. Captured enemy documents from one valley showed nearly a dozen counter-recon companies committed to a single area. The trackers in those units were the danger that mattered most, because they were native to the ground. SOG's own 10 school taught its men exactly what they were up against, and the instruction notes survive, reading now like a warning. The enemy trackers, the school said, were usually local people intimately familiar with the terrain. If they cut your trail and worked out your direction of travel, they would not follow you nose to tail. They would move off to one side, parallel to you, far enough back to stay out of sight, but close enough to keep you within earshot. Their aim was to use a side trail to get ahead of you, link with a local unit, and have an ambush waiting where you were going. If they could not get ahead, they would simply track you to the place you stopped for the night, then send one man back to guide a larger, heavier force in to overrun you in the dark. The lesson the school drove home was blunt. Assume the trackers are there. Take the precautions. Do not let it panic you into a mistake. When the trackers could not flush a team by following it, they tried other ways. On one mission across the border in Laos, a SOG team, led by a young 10 named John Stryker-Meyer, was working near an enemy fuel pipeline when the North Vietnamese set the jungle itself on fire, hoping to burn the team out of cover and into the open where it could be killed or captured. The King Bees came for them anyway, dropping onto a small knoll inside a canyon ringed by mountains, and lifted the team out through the smoke. Flames swallowed the spot where the men had been crouched only moments before. Meyer would remember being astonished that they were all still alive and lying awake that night wondering whether he would live to see his 23rd birthday, a few weeks off. He was running a recon team as a 10 at 22 years old, a junior enlisted soldier carrying decisions that would have weighed on a colonel. On another mission, his 6-man team slipped through ground crawling with tens of thousands of North Vietnamese troops and came out alive. That was the arithmetic these men lived inside, always outnumbered, sometimes by 100 to 1. When a team was found, the word for it was a prairie fire emergency, and it changed everything in the air above. The call meant a team was in contact and running for its life, and it pulled in every aircraft within reach, the Coveys and the Sky Raiders and the gunships and the King Bees, all of them converging on a few square meters of jungle, while the men on the ground tried to stay alive long enough to be lifted out. Plaster described the way the enemy piled on, more and more soldiers gathering against a compromised team the longer it stayed on the ground, so that every minute the helicopters were late made the odds worse. A team could go from quiet to surrounded in the space of an hour. The race to the landing zone, with the trackers and a reaction force closing from behind and the canopy too thick to land, was the shape that death most often took for these men. Anyone who has heard the radio recordings that survive from those days knows the sound of it. A team in contact, voices tight and clipped, calling its situation up to a covey overhead while gunfire crackles under the words. Helicopters and forward air controllers talking over one another on open microphones. A 10 counting his men and his rounds out loud, so the aircraft above will know how little is left. On one tape preserved from the war, 2 teams are fighting for their lives at the same moment, and the men in the air work to sort out which one to reach first. It is not the clean choreography of a film. It is a scramble run by exhausted young men doing arithmetic with lives, and the thing that stays with you is how often that arithmetic still came out in favor of getting somebody home. For a long time, the only answer to the trackers was simply speed. A compromised team ran for an extraction landing zone and prayed the helicopters reached it first. Often they did not. The casualties tell the story without any dramatizing. SOG carried a casualty rate that exceeded 100%, among the highest of any American force in the war, which is to say that nearly every recon man was wounded at least once, and a great many were killed or never found. In 1968, by the unit's own reckoning, SOG took more men killed and wounded than it had positions to fill. 10 teams were lost. 14 teams were overrun or destroyed. The Recon Company at Forward Operating Base 2, near the tri-border country, became the most decorated American unit of the entire war. 5 of its men earned the Medal of Honor. 8 earned the Distinguished Service Cross. Those decorations measure valor, and they also measure how often these men ended up in places where only valor could save them. Running, by itself, was not saving enough of them. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. So the 1-0s worked out something else, and it is documented not as one famous battle, but as a method taught and refined and written down. The counter-track, the stay behind. When a team understood it was being followed, it did not only run. It used the ground to turn the chase around. The mechanics were precise because in this kind of fighting imprecision got men killed. A team that suspected trackers behind it would dogleg, making sharp turns off its line of travel. 90 degrees and then 90 again, so a pursuer cutting the corner gave himself away. It would walk in stream beds for long stretches, sometimes hundreds of meters, because moving water breaks a scent trail and forces a tracker to slow and solve the puzzle of where the trail resumes on the far bank. Against the dog teams the North Vietnamese had begun to use, the Americans scattered tear gas powder back along their own path to foul the animals' noses. They stayed off the ridgelines where a man stands out against the sky, and they chose their ground with care. A favored move was to walk a box, a sequence of square, 90-degree turns that let a team cross back over its own incoming track and stand off to one side, while the trackers worked to decide which way it had truly gone. At the place a team stopped for the night, the spot the men called the Remain Overnight site, the discipline tightened to nothing wasted and nothing dropped, because a tracker who found a sleeping site could read from it not just where a team had been, but how many men it held and how long ago they had risen and moved on. Then the team would do the thing every instinct argues against. It would stop, double back along a route parallel to its own trail, and set an ambush pointing straight back down the path it had just walked. Sometimes a single man stayed behind in a height a short distance from the team's old position, settled in before light, and gone so still he became part of the ground, while the rest of the team moved on and left the campsite looking freshly used. Sometimes the whole team lined a corridor the trackers would have to pass through. Claymore mines went in first, their curved faces angled across the kill zone, the firing wires run back through the undergrowth to the 1-0's hand. And then they waited. The discipline that took is hard to put into words for anyone who has not lain in jungle heat with a professional enemy closing from behind, every nerve telling you to get up and move, and answer that instinct by staying perfectly, deliberately still. The heat sat on them like a wet weight. Insects walked across their hands and faces, and no one lifted a hand to brush them away. The light under the canopy went from green to gray to black, and the constant night noise of the jungle, the frogs and the insects and the far-off water, became a curtain they learned to look through rather than listen to. You stopped hearing the jungle after a while, the recon men said. You started hearing what did not belong in it. This is the moment the whole story has been walking toward. So picture it the way the manuals and the survivors describe it, knowing that the night belongs to a method rather than to one name in a logbook. A tracker is good. He has cut the trail, and he is sure of it. The sign is fresh, the prints are clear, the dog is pulling. He is doing his job exactly as he was trained to do it, with skill earned over years on this same ground. He follows the line into a stretch of bamboo or down toward a stream crossing, the kind of place that funnels a man because there is nowhere else to step. He has no reason to look behind him because behind him is empty. Behind him is where he came from. That is the entire point. What he does not know is that the trail he trusts was made for him to trust. The prints were placed. The bent fern was bent on purpose. The trace of smell was left where a careful man would never leave it, because a careful man wanted it found. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.